is Mr. Palmer doing his grooving thing. How are you, sir? How's life in Colorado?
Life in Colorado, we're dead into the middle of spring, which means that my body has no idea what's going on. I don't know if I'm being mountain man or if I'm summer Jim, but I'm definitely into the cold and flu season. So nice. I got a nice stash of cough drops going on here.
Well, I am glad that at this point in time, this podcast is recorded from a safe social distance of several thousand miles away. Oh, righty. Wow, off the rails in less than a minute. I wouldn't have it any other way.
Were we on the rails, really?
Probably not, but we got to at least fake it a little bit. So
it's like as soon as the music ends, it's just like hard left, hard right, bam. We're just out the door.
Well, yeah, and you know what the crazy thing is? Until we turned on video, and yes, folks, if you still listen to us on the usual audio platforms, that's fine. It still works. But if you've missed it, we are on YouTube, so you can be terrified and see our faces on YouTube if you so choose. But until we started adding the video to the whole component or the elements, whatever you want to call it, the whole mix, we could be as goofy and off the rails as we wanted to visually, and nobody knew unless we actually brought him in on the joke. And now there's no getting around it. So anyways,
there's not.
Now that we went on that tangent for a little bit, what do we have on the agenda today?
You know, we've been kind of busy with all the different conferences. I think we were talking about it on our last episode. And so I was kind of hoping, if it's okay with you, John.
Sure.
If we could get back to the 10 things that I wished you knew about Wi-Fi, or we wished you.
Why are you picking on me?
What do you mean, why am I picking on you?
You said you wished I knew about them.
Well, not you. And I being the greater I
know.
You being the greater.
It's the royal, it's the royal, as my daughter would say, it's the royal use of the word. Yes. Yeah, no, I'm kidding. I'm giving you a hard time just because I can. But yes, I agree. We haven't done, gosh, I'd have to look up and I'm not going to look at the schedule. It has to be about a month since we've done one of these.
Well, but it's funny because this is very apropos because even though I'm not feeling well, I spent like 3 hours at my neighbor, like right here behind me. I spent 3 hours at his house last night trying to convince him that he can't extend the coverage of his R750 by installing a TP link in his living room. And so I was like, man, you're killing me. I was like, I need you to get you. I was like, you got to watch the podcast, man. I was like, get on YouTube, watch the podcast. I said, because there are certain things I need you to know about Wi-Fi so that you don't drive me and your wife nuts. And so, so I'd like to get back to that, mainly so Bob has more video content to watch and maybe stays out of his network gear a little bit longer and gives me some peace and quiet. So, in reality, it's just all about me, right?
Well, I'm Bob now, apparently. So,
well, I got Bob and Walt, which I never planned it like that, but they're great sources of stories for me when it comes to doing my job. So I just hope they don't ever pay attention because then I might have to pay them royalties.
We'll pay them exactly 1% of everything we make off of this podcast.
I'm not giving up my cough drops.
I said that you don't get paid in cough drops. Little
do you know.
Anyways. On that note, yes, I agree. I think we should get back to the 10 things series, if you will, as it has been. Actually, it's probably been a little bit more than a month because of our. I don't even want to call it a hiatus, but it was really hard, as we were just talking about before we hit record, barely. That it's really hard to record, even though we were in the same space for almost a week. It was really hard to record any show, let alone it's as close to scripted as we'll get, basically, probably. Actually, the one we did last week at the end of last week that won't see the light of day was probably the closest to scripted. But, yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. All right. So, 10 things you need to know about Wi-Fi. At least the 10 things that we came up with. So, as you remember, if you've been paying attention, you've already gone through the first 3. Client's always in charge. More is not always better. And what are the requirements? So the next one is, it all starts with a good design. Now, I think this is very apropos after going to the conferences that I went to, or the conference you went to, because there's always a lot of good conversation. There's a lot of conversation in general. Most of it good, some of it maybe not quite so good. Talking about design and design tools and design methodologies and stuff like that. And so I want to take a little bit of time on this episode to kind of bring some of those discussions to the greater population, to the greater good, to talk about, it all starts with a good design, because it really does. My good friend Jake, he has a big thing, and he's like, never solve with software what you can solve with a very good design, with a good solid design. And we get to this point after we talk about clients and requirements, which is actually kind of what I think I even planned it this way, because, learning about the requirements and learning about the clients that you have in your network is where you can then get to the point where you can do the design. Without having this information, then it's really kind of hard to do a good design. You can do a design, but it's not going to be great. Now, the next thing we need to talk about here, John, is this is always about garbage in, garbage out. You just can't get around it, right?
Nope, that's a loaded one too.
Well, I mean, it's loaded, but it's not when you think about it.
No, I meant loaded as in there's a lot of different garbage that we could talk about what we've had to ingest as going into the design process.
Well, but we're going to just go ahead and assume for the time being that the garbage in we're talking about is things like, we have the wrong clients, or we have the wrong requirements, or you have the wrong wall type,
or no floor plan,
or no. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, but there's always ways to get around the floor plan thing.
My favorites have always been like and if you've taken a class for any design, somebody will always tell you, oh, just take a picture of the fire escape plan. Mm-hmm. And it might work. It's, I don't want to say like, the any port in a storm kind of thing, but like it's the work. I mean, it's
not the best.
No, I mean, it's one of those where like, it's not quite as bad as when I had to do a design for a warehouse and I never had the floor plan. I just had the outer shell. Pro tip, that warehouse was a rectangle, and how and where the shelves go kind of matter. But anyways, no, it's garbage in, garbage out. Whatever you give in, you're going to get out. It's simple. It is simple at the end of the day.
So let's talk about some design items that kind of go into this. And we have some time, so we're just going to kind of go over this a little bit. The first thing, scale. This is something, if you've ever talked to or taken a class, they always talk about scale. If you get your scale wrong, then the whole thing's lost, because all these tools are based on free space path loss. And so when you put the scale onto your building, or if you forget, then it doesn't know exactly how big it is, but it takes the scale that you add and it extrapolates it out and says like, okay, so if this one wall is this distance, then it means that, between where you put the AP and this random interior walls, it's going to be this distance. So we can then calculate out, how far away the signal is going to be, stuff like that. So, but if you get it wrong, if you get the scale wrong, then, that's the part of the garbage in, garbage out. So I know some of the things that I've heard about scaling, when you put in a scale, is make sure you pick a really big wall, a large wall, and something that you can get really accurate on. Because if you do a small, like if you just say, hey, the door frame, when you think about the size of a building, and you know what? We're actually going to go back and forth on this one, John. And we're going to take a look at this floor plan that I have pulled up here to be unannounced, or no, it's announced. We're just not going to name it, mainly because I don't want to give back any of the payment I got from him because I drank it all. If you were to say, take the scale of one of these door frames, or the door opening right here in this break room, if you're off by just a tiny little bit where you click within the map, to put your scale in, it's gonna just be wrong because there's such a small margin of error. Because I mean, if that's 36 inches and you're off by just a little bit, or if it's a 30-inch door and you're off by just the slightest little bit, like when you click on the floor plan to put that scale in, then the whole thing gets blown way off.
Now, I will say this though, I have to argue the counterpoint.
Okay.
Especially because I feel triggered. I feel seen because door frames were one of my go-to. If there were no measurements, if I was getting a floor plan and I had to do a predictive, and I couldn't get anybody to give me the local measurements of like from point A to point B, I have two options. Option one was I looked up the zoning that we had to adhere to, and the door frames are supposed to be in compliance with the zoning laws, ADA and all the other stuff. So 100% agree. If you're off by just a little bit, it can throw off the entire predictive modeling. It's not a survey, it's a predictive model. But it's one of those things where if you don't have anything else to go by and you know that it's going to be in compliance with zoning, it's not the worst in the world to go with. But the other option I would go to, especially if you're dealing with like a building, not just like a room or a portion of a room or a portion of a building, rather, Google Maps, Google Earth. Because you can get the outside measurements. And I'm sorry if I'm stealing your thunder, but those are my two go-tos, but the door frames are definitely one. At the end of the day, there's no substitute for walking the space and taking your own measurements, but I'm sure I'm jumping ahead of myself.
No, you're not. This is the time to bring this stuff up. I think any Wi-Fi professional will tell you that we have used Google Maps and Google Earth more times than we care to admit. And we picked two corners. And I'll tell you for this particular building, that's exactly what I did. I went from this upper left corner up here, and I went down to this bottom left corner down here because that was two corners that I could pick up on Google Earth, and I could say, what is that distance? But, I will say one thing onto your door frame thing, which is, again, it's valid. If you have nothing else, then you have nothing else. You need something, right? But if you know and understand the limitations of what you get from that, then it's 100% a valid way of doing things. I mean, it's better to have something and have it be a little off than to have nothing because you went, well, I refuse to use the width of a door as my scale.
And to clarify, it's less about us unwilling to use a certain measurement that we think might be right. It's more about you get a client or a customer or a project and you get a floor plan, but there's no measurements on the floor plan. There's no scale at the bottom corner of it. And you have nobody that's able to work with you at the local site, amazingly enough, nobody has a tape measure or a ruler or any other way to say like, hey, this office in the top left corner of the floor plan is an 8x10 office. And that's really what it is. And I've been doing this long enough. I'm sure you had the same, well, maybe not because you did come from a place where you were only working that facility, but we've all heard stories. We've all had the experiences where you get something where you literally just getting a floor plan. You've got no numbers on it. There's nothing. And you're not local to that site. So it's hard to do the measurements. But what I will add is in those instances, make sure to cover your own butt. You tell them like, look, it goes back to what you just said, garbage in, garbage out. If I have no measurements and I've got nobody willing to give me a measurement, take a yardstick, whatever, and give me, I just need to know from point A to point B is 3 feet or point A to point B is 10 feet. Cause like you said, it's a little bit more margin for error or whatever, or less margin for error, whatever. Unless you've got somebody to do that, you put the caveat on that predictive design model rather, that says this needs to be validated because there were no hard, I didn't take out my laser measure on site and confirm that from point A to point B was really 42.6 feet.
And, it's funny. This is one of the things that I'd never really heard of until I joined the Wi-Fi community about having laser measurer. And it's like, all of a sudden you start talking to these people that actually do it professionally as opposed to sort of the, hey, I'm doing it because no one else will. And like these guys start comparing notes on what's their favorite laser measurer. And you're just like, how do you people know about this stuff? And it's like, well, because we have to know all this stuff, the height, how high is my ceiling? What's this length? And so they're just like, oh yeah, this little laser measure. And now that I have one, I'm like, how did I ever live without one of these things? Because like I use it at my house all the time. It's just like, well, how big of the room is this? I don't know. Let me go grab my measure. I, put it up against one wall, shoot the laser to the other side. Done.
And now after having dinner with Peter 3 weeks ago now, I want another one because he mentioned something that's actually really cool, but we don't have to get into that now. Anyways, no, it's important to have the right measurements. Scale matters.
Scale matters.
If you doubt us, take your favorite design tool, put the right scale in and see what design tells you, and then put the wrong scale in and see how different your design becomes.
So just as important, if not more important with the scale is the attenuation values, and I'm going to go back over here to our planning tool. We're going to take a look at this. And I think we can see it on here that there's different colors. Let me zoom in on here a little bit.
Yeah, I can definitely see different colors.
You can see some yellows. You can see some gray, or those are actually brown. There's some purples, red. There's some silvers. And all of those are different types of walls that I put in, that I've drawn in here. And I did this really quick because I was trying to prove a point. So accuracy did not matter on this one.
Looks pretty
It was
good,
more of a, well, I'll tell you what, when you do these crazy angles, it gets a little wonky if you don't zoom in really close and take your time. I was just kind of throwing them there. But more importantly, most of the design tools will have all of these different tools, or in their tool, they'll have all these different types of material types. To your point, like, retail shelves, warehouse shelves, windows, tinted windows, wood. And so for the most part, you kind of end up guessing at this especially if you're not on site. However, you're not supposed to. And so this goes into that. This is actually much more critical. Thanks, Christopher.
Good old Simo. See, I told him he had to be on the show again. That doesn't count, though.
It doesn't count.
No.
Let's see. So now we've unofficially had Simo and Sharon on.
Yep.
But anyway, there's actually ways that you can go measure and find out what exactly is the attenuation value of each one of these walls, and don't guess. Because too many times you find out, you're like, oh, there is, this wall right here used to be like an exterior wall. And so it's actually brick that they just put sheetrock over top of. So now you have sheetrock, brick, and sheetrock. But you just draw it as, oh, this is sheetrock. And then it doesn't work. And then you want to know why. Well, it's because generally speaking, it's for a design tool, you probably put in the wrong attenuation values. And whether that's for a wall or in this particular tool, they actually have, you can put in these different server racks. So in these particular server rooms, there are some racks. And so you can actually draw in some attenuation for saying, hey, I have a server rack. And there happens to be a switch that's in this server rack. And so those things matter. Now, I can also tell you that somewhere over in this part of the building is some Faraday cages that they built. But I'm not sure where they are, so I can't put them in my drawing. So that means my tool is completely wrong. Now, I know that. And so I'm allowed to do these things because I'm like, I know that there's values that I'm missing. And so it's things like that, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about if you know that that's what you're doing, if you know that those are the rules you're breaking. I think Lee Badman did a presentation about it at WLPC about, breaking the rules. If you know why you're doing it, if you know what you're doing, then you are. But the attenuation values, really critical. Same thing with the attenuation zones, like I was just showing. Too many times it's too hard to say, hey, I have a specific wall, or or something else like, or a window, a door. And it's like, hey, you know what? I have an attenuation zone. And so you can actually draw that and you measure it the same way. You know, what's my signal on one side of that zone? What's my signal on the other side of that zone? And you can draw that into the tool and say, you know what? Like, I know there's a wall with a bunch of metal filing cabinets. That would be, you know, an attenuation zone because it's not just one metal, it's a whole zone of stuff. And so you can build in the zones, but it's all about, you know, making sure you know and understand these things, because quite honestly, putting APs on a map is the easiest part of the job.
Yeah, no, I agree. You mentioned the attenuations. My favorite use of that, by the way, was warehouses.
Yeah.
It's the favorite use. And it was one of those things where if you've never done it before, you know, maybe you never used an attenuation zone. And if you've never done a warehouse, you're like, how do I model this? I mean, you've got all these random shelves. Now, but the problem with those, again, getting way into the weeds, warehouse shelves, depending on what you're warehousing, can change.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the things about doing warehouses that it really is its own little unique thing, because, you know, one week it could be one thing, and then the next week they're completely empty, and then the third week, you know, all of a sudden you're storing, you know, giant vats of, you know, of windshield washer fluid, and it's like wow, that's wildly different attenuation than, you know, saying I got some, you know, open wooden shelves, or I have couches. I mean, it's just that whole thing.
Yeah, it's one of those where I think, you know, we could do a whole show or series on just designing in warehouses and LPV type settings. It's one of those where it really is best effort, almost best guess, because you can ask them. I mean, you might get lucky. You might have a long-term storage facility where you know exactly what's going to be on those shelves at all times, and it's just going to be different shelves getting further populated. But if it's if it's a shipping warehouse or something like that, it could change weekly. It could change hourly, depending on how rapidly they're turning over. So it really will have to become a best guess kind of thing. So anyways.
And this is actually probably the hardest thing. You know, we talked about with requirements, that getting the requirements was the hardest thing. You know, after you have the requirements, trying to get all of that stuff built into the tool, that is really, you know, there's certification courses you can take for the design tools, at least for two of them. And to me, it was actually more about using the tool and knowing how to build those different values into the tool. I mean, because we haven't even gotten to different client types, you know, of saying how many clients are going to be in a space, you know, what type of services do we need in there? You know, what type of service expectation, SLAs do we need to have in these different spaces? You know, and if you know how to do that, if you know that the tool does all that stuff for you, and you can get all that stuff designed, you can say, I'm going to have X number of clients in this space. I'm going to have Y number of clients in this space. This is what the requirements are. This is all that information I need to have. Once you get to that point in you know, doing your design, getting all that information transferred into your tool, so your tool then has all the information and all the correct information that you need it to have. It's only at that point that you can actually start sitting down to put the dots on the map. And I don't know about you, but for me, once you get to that point, it's pretty simple. You know, you're like, oh, let's put an AP here. Yeah. Let's put an AP here. And the tools nowadays are so good that they'll do the rest of the work for you. You know, it's not something that you have to fight and struggle with anymore. Now, all these other things we've talked about, that's actually where the work comes in. That is where all of the preparation and all that work goes into. And once that's done and locked in, design is simple.
Yeah, and the beauty part with this is twofold, right? So if you've been listening, if you've been paying attention to the series up to this point, again, we covered the requirements beforehand, and we've talked about the clients driving everything. So it's all, Jim actually did plan this to an extent. At least it seems like that so far. So we'll give him credit.
I did.
But it all plays in, right? Your requirements all of those things like the attenuation zones, it all comes from the requirements effort, the requirements gathering. And here's the sort of the two thing, the second thing, the pro tip, if you will. I know nowadays, ever since 2020, because some little bug popped up from some lab somewhere, we stopped going on site. We stopped traveling. We stopped getting into the weeds and actually getting our hands on the facilities that we're building out and supporting. And as much as it's nice to sit at home and not commute on a daily basis, it's important, especially for those of us doing design and supportive design, it's important to get out there and walk the space, to take your measurements, even if you're not doing an AP on the stick survey, which I completely understand. It's a very, very involved effort. But if you take a couple measurements, you check a couple of the walls, and you kind of do, I don't want to call it good enough per se, but you just eyeball it and say, okay, this seems like it's good old standard drywall office. This is a recent construction. It's probably nothing exotic. I say that, but make sure you check the glass, because if it's titanium glass, good luck. Things like that. You get your information, because at the end of the day, and I covered this in my RCWA class a couple weeks ago, you look at a floor plan. What's one thing they don't show you on the floor plan? Typically.
People?
No, your ceiling.
Oh, yeah.
So where are you putting your APs? I mean, this is one of those like gotchas that you don't necessarily think about when you're drawing it for the first time. You assume, bad that it may be, you assume that you've got a drop ceiling to work off of. But what if you don't? What if where you put your AP, what if exactly where you wanted that AP is where the duct is? So this is why walking a floor as much as you can is important. And that's one of those things that's great to do on the requirements day. You go talk to the customer, you get your requirements, you kind of eyeball the people and keep them honest, because let's be honest, if they don't tell you about scanners and you're walking the floor and you go, hey, I just saw 5 scanners, they're on Wi-Fi. So you can, not that you're trying to go, aha, I got you, you lied. No, it's just keep them honest, because there's some things that maybe these people don't even realize they have. They might be 6 months in on the job, and those scanners have been there for 8 years. They predate them. So it's important to get out and see the sites.
So it's funny you talk about the ceiling. We need to put a link in the show notes. And if you're listening, if you've made it this far, you need to go watch this presentation about a group out of, I want to say they're out of Helsinki, and they were having problems doing a whole bunch of networks because they ran into the ceiling problem of, hey, guess what? One of the new things is that industrial look where they don't put in a ceiling. It's all just exposed, right? So it's all the exposed ducting. And they were like, where are we supposed to mount the APs now? And so they've gone through they went through 3 or 4 different iterations of trying to come up with their own way to mount these things. And what they've come up with is pretty interesting. But this story about how they did it is actually really kind of fun. So we'll have to put that link in there. I think it's called the More Than Universal Mounting Solution or something. It's actually kind of funny. So let's see. The last thing I think I want to talk about, although I might have one more thing, is I want to talk about, and this is my biggest pet peeve, quite honestly. This is my biggest pet peeve. And there's more to the tool than the coverage heat map. Now, if you're listening, you know what I'm talking about, right? Because everybody's like, oh yeah, we want to have the heat map. We're going to show it here. We're going to show the Wi-Fi heat map. And we're going to take a look at this and we're going to say, hey, this is my Wi-Fi coverage. And we'll see if we can scroll around here. And right, so we're looking at primary coverage, Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz. So here's my heat map. It looks really bad, right?
It depends.
Well, it's even worse if we take a look at secondary coverage. Or if you go to tertiary coverage, then it looks really bad, right?
Sure.
Well, there's only 3 APs, so tertiary coverage is kind of going to be shot, right? But here's the thing, right? There's ways that this information can be gamed. And one of the things I'm going to show you is on this particular AP down here, the transmit power was turned down to 5 dBm. So it's easy to be like, hey, well, what if we turn that thing up to 20 dBm? Oh, now look. Now we're looking much better. So what if I come into this one and we're going to double that? We're going to go from 10 dBm to 20 dBm. Oh, look, that got way better. Now let's come down into this guy in the corner. Let's take it from 10. We're going to bump him up to 20 dBm. So now look at my heat map. Look how well I did at a design, right? Now, the other way you can do this is you're going to say, hey, you know what? Let's add in some more APs. So let's put in look, we need an AP there. That'll fill in that hole. Let's put an AP over here. We need an AP over here. I think we need some more APs.
Somewhere the Wi-Fi Hulk is getting angry.
Well, no, but it's all green, right? Look at this.
It's precisely.
Look how well I'm doing.
As somebody in sales, I love seeing this because it's great, and I'll happily sell you that many access points. But
we don't want an AP out there.
The CWNE in me is getting a little bit triggered.
Well, but if you look at it, right, we got this great coverage. We have all this great stuff, and we can come down and you go, look at my secondary coverage.
Yeah, but
it's just as good.
I want to see the other stuff. Mm-hmm.
So let's see, signal to noise. Look, I got no interference. But what we're not seeing here, and I'm kind of picking on them, is we're not, and quite honestly, the reason why we're not going to see it is I think I set my channel widths too narrow. But if we were to go in and we were to set these things and say, hey, you know what? We're going to run 160 megahertz wide channels. Because let's see, transmit power. Oh, let's take a look at the channels here. Oh no, let's go to Wi-Fi. Yeah, 40 megahertz. So let's put these at 160.
Good God.
Well,
you're a savage.
I am. So our secondary coverage is good. But so this is the point I was trying to prove to everybody, right? Because I've seen this on social media. I've seen this on different messaging boards where it's like, oh, just get somebody to throw together some APs on a heat map. And I see this all the time where people are like, they're like, oh, but my coverage is great. And they're like, oh, look, I got a little hole down here. So you know what? We're just going to go ahead and we're going to drop an AP down in here because we're just going to get rid of that hole, right? And so they're just like, it's like, hey, I can make any heat map look green. I can make it look really great. I can take my client in here and I can be like, hey, I got a data rate of 1922 megabits per second. Now I'm getting interference from 5 APs. And this tool will actually point that out and tell you, be like, hey, you know what? This is not great. You should probably stop this. And you can see, because I think I have all the power cranked up on these things. So It's just a disaster, right?
To anybody watching along, do not ever replicate this design in production, ever. Unless you plan on having a really bad day.
Well, don't, because again, and this is the whole point of my argument, right? Is I can make it look really green if we only take a look at one of the views.
Sure.
And if I only look at coverage, I look at data rates. I got great data rates. But when we take a look at the interference, we get this little pop-up down here going, you got a bunch of problems.
Yeah, I think interference is on this one. I think health was on the other survey tool that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so there's the tools.
I always looked at that first, to be honest.
See, and that's what people forget. And this is why I'm doing this. This is why I took the time to do all this stuff and go through all this live, is because I want people to know and understand that the actual coverage map, this one right here, I only glance at that like in passing, and I'm just like, whoom. Because the other way I could do it is if I were to make each one of these walls be like 40 dB of attenuation, then it would all work because, and then I could put in an AP in every single room and it would work because I put bad data in.
Yeah.
The tools are not bad. Our use of the tools is bad. So when you hear people talk about, I'm going to do this design, know and understand that there's ways to do it right. There's also a lot of ways to do it wrong, and there's ways to hide it. But if you know to look, if you know to say, hey, I want to look at stuff other than data rate or signal to noise, any of those other things, you'll be okay.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the health view, and again, it's not hard to make it look green. It's looking at something that shows you the interference and the health of the network. It's going to give you an idea of what the client experience is going to be like. Am I going to have a problem roaming? I love looking at the secondary and tertiary coverage if the design requirements from, again, a prior episode call for those things to be of concern. Some networks, some of your customers aren't going to care. I happen to have designed some of my networks to have tertiary coverage, so I cared. But it all, again, it depends.
Well, and that's the thing is, the tools are good, but you have to use them right, and you have to know what you're doing. So, when somebody's like, oh, I have a heat map, I get frustrated because I'm like, well, anybody can make a heat map looks really good to sell something, but that's not what I want to do. That's not what I want to focus on, because there's more to the tool than a coverage heat map. And when you're doing a design, make sure that if you have access to these tools, you're using them right. Because if you put garbage into the tool, you're going to get garbage out. And it's just, there's no other way to do it.
Yeah. And for anybody that's looking at this kind of wondering about, your comment about making it all green, having heard this one too many times as an example from people, and the sort of the, I'm going to pick on salespeople, but like the uninformed, right? The non-Wi-Fi nerds out there were like, oh, all green's good, because they would see the orange and the yellow and the red and the different gradients and go, I want it all green. They don't understand, and you have to be able to explain to them. And if you don't already know this, you're going to know this. But that helps you roam, right? That's where you're transitioning from one AP to another. That's your sell edge. You need that. Otherwise, your clients are never going to roam anywhere. So it's important to understand what that is and why that's there, and it's not bad. And ultimately, if you look at it, depending on the tool, you can typically set the color codes. So if it really bothers people to see anything other than green, just change the color coding. But it's, honestly, like yellow is like negs, or, yellow or orange tend to be like neg 65, neg 67, which is perfectly fine. But check the scaleless. Yeah. And they're Jim's.
Yeah, that's what we're doing right. This is, so if you really wanted to make it good, be like, oh, we're going to make that a neg 90. We're going to make this a neg 85. And then we're going to make this a neg 75. Right. So now we've adjusted our scale to where now we can take out all kinds of APs, and we're still going to have great, because, well, our scale's wrong.
Yeah. But, and it's one of those, again, where don't be afraid. It doesn't have to be all green. Just make sure you know what you're explaining. And if you've got somebody who is insistent on seeing all green on the map, don't add APs to make the map green. Just do what Jim did and just change your key, if you will, so that it just it has a little bit more green and less of the other colors. Because at the end of the day, you do need to have some differentiation between APs. Otherwise, your clients will be stuck all over the place. So, anyways,
and this actually goes back to my neighbor Bob. It's all right, Bob. Bob was worried because he had an egg 67.
The horror.
And so I'm not even sure what this bottom number was supposed to be or what it was. I'll have to go back and look. But yeah, to John's point, you want to have these yellows. The yellows aren't bad. It's not. Now the reds you don't want, but it's okay to have a, green to yellow. It's okay to have some of those in there, because at the end of the day, like to John's point, that's what helps our clients roam. You want to have these different shades of green. You want to have that in there. And like I said, even some yellows aren't really bad. You look at this. This is my weakest signal, and it's a neg 68. Neg 68 still is very good. And so these are the things that drive people like us nuts, is people that misuse the tool, They insist on all green, and then they want to know, they go, well, I had a heat map. Why doesn't my network work? Well, now you know a little bit.
There's more to a heat map than a heat map.
There is more to a heat map than just a heat map. And so, yeah, if you know and understand these things, and you can be like, hey, at the end of the day, I have my design. I do a good design because I know and understand all these things. Then, it gives you a much better chance, because nothing's going to ever happen without some type of weird anomaly going to happen. Nothing ever goes perfect, which is fine. And as long as you know that and you can work with it, then it's an easy thing to work around, and we can do it. So I think that's about it. Our next episode, going to talk about a default or two or three.
We've got some stories there. Oh, I'm not going to touch that one. All right.
I didn't think you would.
Not yet. We'll save it for the next one. So let's go back to that so we don't have to see that. No, we'll save that for the next one. And that is all I have, Mr. Palmer. That was good. I like getting back into it. And again, and we've said this all the time, and it could be almost like a tagline. I could actually have it set up on the soundboard, just hit the button. But this is an episode, and we could do a whole series just on design conversations. There's, it's just, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're really curious about it, let us know. Maybe we'll do another design series, or bring somebody on to talk about some design horror stories, if you will. And, or as Jim said, there's a couple, 2-3 classes that I can think of off the top of my head that are maybe by a tools vendor and or by CWNP that cover design pretty well. So there's definitely materials out there. We can certainly point you in those directions as well. That's it for me.
Yeah, thanks for sitting in and listening to us rant about some of the things that drive us nuts.
There's there's everything for that. But anyways, on that note, we will see you guys on the next episode. If you want to contact the show directly, you can email us using the address ruckcast@comscope.com. To learn more about Ruckus products and services that we may have talked about on this or any other podcast, please check the links in the About section of the show.